welcome to our new episode. Today we have with us Professor Markovits. She is Professor of English and Director of Undergraduate Studies at Yale University. Her research focuses on English literature of the long 19th century, both Romantic and Victorian, as well as German classical literature, aesthetic theory, war and literature, and genre theory. So from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in kind of a range of topics, but especially English literature of the long 19th century and the themes that come out of that. So I know a lot of graduate students find it difficult to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think of that process of choosing what or who to study. How do you approach that process of pinning down what or who resonates with you? And what led you to your own research?
Yeah. I mean, I guess originally I came into this area of study. I first did a master's in Romantic Studies, actually in England at Oxford. And I began as a Romanticist, I think, because it came out of my intellectual formation in college, where I was a double major in English and philosophy. And that's a very natural confluence if you're going to go into the Romantic period, because there were just so many of the Romantic poets were engaged with philosophical forms of thought. But when I came back to graduate school in the States, I sort of returned to my first love. And I think I grew up reading Victorian novels. I grew up reading Jane Austen and George Eliot and the Brontes and so on. And I decided that, in fact, what I think I discovered was there were a lot of connections between the novelists that had been my first love and the kind of set of philosophical concerns that I had developed an interest in while doing my master's on the Romantic period. And so the one came sort of flowed into the other. I think quite naturally. When I talk to my own graduate students about how you should come up with an idea, or in fact to my undergraduates as well, who are thinking about what should I write a senior essay on, I'm really interested in sort of pursuing an in-depth topic on my own in this way, but I don't quite know what my subject is. And I always tell them to go back and to reread the essays they've written in the past. And in many instances, you'll find that you have been asking versions of the same question and applying them to different texts, but versions of the same question. That was certainly true for me. I discovered that I had, for my dissertation, which turned into my first book, I discovered I was really interested in the ways in which our sense of the reality of a lived experience emerged when there was a conflict between someone's ambitions and what they were able to achieve in the world. And so when there was this kind of failure, in fact. And so my first book, which is called The Crisis of Action in 19th Century British Literature, came out of that experience of my interest in these different kinds of failure across a variety of writers and genres.
Definitely. Yeah. So, can you set the stage for us, so to speak, and tell us some of these key themes that are at play in the time period that we're discussing today, the long 19th century? So, what do we need to know about what was happening at the time to aptly
Yeah.
understand the major characteristics of the fine art, literature, and drama of this era?
Yeah, I think it was not in some regards not unlike our own, a century of tremendous change. And so change, I think, is the keynote here, fueled partly by, the Industrial Revolution, which was bringing people from the country into the city in unprecedented numbers, into not only the city of London, but into these newly emerging cities in the north, industrial cities, places like Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, these new centers of industry that change the nature of one's experience of one's own environment. Alongside that, there were the two big reform bills of the period, political reform. So increasing number of men were getting the vote. And then, of course, you have the large scale version of this, which is imperial expansion, which is going on throughout the period, making the connection between the periphery and the center narrower and narrower as people move around in these contexts. And you have Darwin in the middle of the century, and the kind of pressures put on religious belief alongside these various other developments. So what I called in my first book, The Crisis of Action, a kind of crisis of faith, it's often termed in that way, although it's not that religion is lost, it's that there are new pressures put upon it. So those are some of the sort of big questions that are facing people living in this period, just a period of dramatic change, I would say.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it is definitely like not unlike our own,
Yeah.
where technology is advancing so quickly, climate change, different things like this. And I think when change happens in a period, the literature coming out of it is really interesting and very, very reactive to what's happening at the time, which I think is definitely the case here. So I'd love to turn also to the topic of genre, which you have a lot of interesting thoughts on. So first of all, could you please just define genre for anyone who
Yeah.
might not know not know what it is, and also tell us a bit about how genre and form are
Yeah.
different and similar,
Yeah.
maybe. I don't
Yeah.
know.
They're both different and similar. These are any definition I attempt will be contested because they are both very contested categories. And
Definitely.
there is, I think, for me, they're both heuristic terms. So they're terms that are useful. And they're useful to describing phenomena that you see repeated across different texts, for example. Form is in some ways the more capacious term. It's bigger, it's more abstract. Some people think it's less socially embedded than the idea of genre, and I think it's certainly less socially embedded in the sense that you can think of form as distinct from its social context. Genre is always embedded in a particular moment in time and cultural formation. So John Frau talks about the social life of form as being one way in which we can think of genre. Some other ideas that I think are useful to bring to it is Hans Robert Jauss's idea of the horizon of expectations, that when you pick up a novel that you've been told is science fiction, that means you expect certain things about the world that it describes. So it brings with it a horizon of expectations. The other thing I would say is I've always found very useful is the idea of a kind of recipe. Or Carolyn Williams talks about the close relationship between genre and parody. A genre is something that can be parodied. That is to say, it's a formation that's recognizable enough that you can pick out its key elements, and people will say, oh, they're making fun of I don't know, chick lit or whatever it is. You can see it in there. And so you can think of a genre as something for which you could propose a recipe, which doesn't mean any given example in the genre will have, like a good cook will tweak a recipe, a good writer will tweak the elements of the genre. But you can say, if it's a Bildungsroman, it'll center on an orphan. It'll involve a journey, probably from the provinces to the city. It will involve the search for a career. It will involve a careful attention to characterization. It will involve a conflict between society and the individual. You can sort of think of these elements that you can put together to create an example of a given genre. Although ultimately, as the Supreme Court says about pornography, you'll know it when you see it. So there's the ultimate test will be in the reader's experience or the viewer's experience of the work of art.
So I guess there are ways in which genre has been closed in a bubble or a box, but maybe the boundaries sometimes between genres are a bit unstable as well. Would you say?
Very unstable. Yes, yes. And nothing's ever you can use the idea of family resemblance to think about it too. Instances in a genre will have a family resemblance to each other, but there might be something else that's sort of outside of the strict family that nevertheless looks a lot like the example that we're looking at, or there are different kinds of relation. And the borders are very hard. These are not borders one would want to police.
Definitely. I completely agree. So, looking at your article, Form Things, looking through genre through European diamonds, you write, quote, Genre has long been recognized as a category every bit as slippery as thing and form, as a heuristic marker designating family resemblance rather than clearly definable types. Yet, the act of marking generic families always involves a consideration of both containing forms, chapters, stanzas, temporal frames, and things contained, abstract, like themes and plots, and more concrete, as in the objects and people that help define the world of the realist novel. So, genre allows us to look closely at how the forms and things of literature interact within a cultural medium. So, this is beautifully put, I think. It's fascinating. Can you elaborate a bit for us on these thoughts? How do you differentiate one genre from another with these markers? How does genre inform thing and form, and vice versa?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think first just a little background for that passage. It emerged out of a very specific moment in the history of our discipline, where suddenly a lot of people were paying close attention to form as a concept. So there was a kind of neo-formalist moment about a decade ago. It's lasted longer than that, but roughly speaking. And there was this new sort of sub-discipline of literary studies called thing theory. And I was interested in the confluence of these two methodological schools and the ways in which they spoke to each other and the ways in which they weren't speaking to each other, partly because the new formalism at that moment was especially located within the world of poetry studies. And the thing theory was especially located within the world of the novel. And so I was just curious about this fact and what could bring them together. And the article that I produced is really focused on one particular thing that is simultaneously a form, and that is a diamond. And what happens when you see examples of diamonds or the language of diamonds emerge in a novel, and what happens when you see them emerge in the context of poetry, and are they the same or are they different? And I think ultimately I decided that they share characteristics, but they are actually quite distinct also. And so thinking about this sort of piece of portable property, to use the Dickensian term for it, and thinking about a gem that itself, you often think of something as being set in a setting, right? You can think of a ring or a necklace or whatever. It seemed a really sort of neat, tidy way to start thinking about some of the differences between verse and novel. And to use Caroline Levine's term, they're affordances, right? What are the affordances of a diamond when you put it into a lyric poem? Well, when you put a diamond into a lyric poem, it makes you think about condensation. It makes you think about how very, very dense a lyric poem can be. It might make you think about transcendence. This becomes a symbol of a kind of transcendence. It might make you think about purity, you know. If you take that same object, a diamond, and put it into a novel, it changes its functionality. It takes on a different set of affordances. I think it's temporal affordances, the fact that it persists through time, and narratives all about sort of, and then, and then, and then, and then, and then. Its persistence through time becomes a really useful attribute of it. So rather than being sort of a symbol of immortality or transcendence of the temporal realm, it becomes a marker of the temporal realm. Similarly, its monetary value becomes more important in the world of the novel. And the fact that it kind of changes register when you move it between these two generic worlds helps us recognize things about those generic worlds too, and about the value systems that they suggest to a reader and make use of when we encounter them as text. So I just thought it was useful. And a diamond is what that article focused on. I think a diamond is especially useful in this regard, but there are other things. And so I've thought a fair amount, for example, about peas, which seem about as far from a diamond as you can get. Can there be a poetry of peas? And
I
what would
love
it?
it.
And in fact, there are examples of P's in poetic discourse, but they're rare and they're quite different from the use of P's in novels, for example. And so it's just interesting to me to sort of, I think one thing that I've discovered about my own way of approaching the work that I do is that I really like to have something I can grasp a hold of to make sense of these vast realms of discourse that I'm trying to approach. And so when I can find something like that, it's really helpful. The book that I've been working, that I've just finished and that's about to come out this spring is on numbers in literature. And
Mm.
in that book, again, so it was both pleasurable and useful to me. What the book really does is I look at a bunch of writers who just incorporate a lot of numbers into their writing, and I think about why. But it gave me a handle. I can be reading and suddenly there's a number and I think, huh, is that an interesting number or is it a boring number? What kind of work is being done by that number? And it occurs to me that in some way the diamonds and the numbers are doing the same kind of work for me, right? They're letting me find some purchase on a topic that is otherwise slippery.
Definitely. So it's kind of important to have that grounding aspect while you
Mhm.
think about these vast and kind of abstract sometimes theories, to have something grounding you, something constant
Yeah, yeah.
as you look at these. Definitely. Um, so I would also love to turn to your book, The Crisis of Action in 19th Century English Literature. You identify what you call a crisis of action taking place in the 19th century and its literature. And you explore the works of William Wordsworth, Henry Hugh Clow, George Eliot, and Henry James. So can you tell us a little bit about what this crisis of action is and what exactly this means for the people living in this time period?
Yeah, yeah. So I've alluded to some aspects of it already. The sort of the part of the crisis of action is a function of industrialization and of the fact that people are no longer in control of all aspects of what they do. The division of labor, you do your little bit, but it's very hard to see how this fits into a greater whole or a greater ambition. We can think of forces like the crisis in religion. It used to be that your sense of the world might have been determined by your sense of a divine presence, organizing your experiences and ensuring that you had a place in the grand scheme of things, and that your your actions were meaningful, even if not heroic in scope. Speaking of the heroic, it's also a period in which the idea of the heroic is hotly contested and troubled. So in the middle of the century, you have Carlyle writing his essays, delivering his lectures on the heroic in history. What does it mean to be a modern hero? We're no longer knights on jousting in a sort of visible tournament. And instead, we, insofar as we go to war, which we do less, it's wars that are dictated by confusion more than by sort of obvious moments of heroism. So partly that was, those are some of the ideas that I was thinking about in the second book on the Crimean War, that this is a war that's thought of largely in sort of bureaucratic terms and largely by virtue of its failures rather than its successes. So yes, I think there are crises on many, many fronts. Um, Again, not unrelated to our modern experience of the world, in which you can be faced with this vast dilemma that is the climate crisis, and you just don't know as an individual how what can I do to make things better. That anything I do is so trivial when we're thinking about the scale of the problem. And I think that kind of scale really first emerges as a sort of noticeable part of most people's experience in the 19th century. It's also the rise of statistics that make that especially visible, I think.
So it kind of is this idea of change pushing forward this crisis of action,
Yeah.
and taking root in the people, in the literature, every aspect of life. I
Yeah.
definitely think it is similar to what's happening now, economically, politically, geographically, in terms of climate. But yeah, so I guess change is the only constant, maybe one can argue. But I'd also love to read a bit from the book's front matter, which reads, quote, by emphasizing the importance of inaction, both frustrated action and internalized action, Markovits shows how the Victorian psychological novel develops out of romantic poetry. So, can you tell us a little bit about how this might connect to our earlier conversation on the topic of genre, how one genre and one form can develop out of another? What does it mean for one genre to have roots in another? And what characteristics can we see in these texts in this particular case? Does that mean that the genre is a genre of two, a kind of hybrid genre, or
Yeah.
is it a genre in its own right? I'm not
Yeah.
sure, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's a genre in its own right, and it's also hybrid. My third book is on the novel in verse, which is literally a hybrid genre, but also a genre in its own right, I think. So there are different ways in which you can think of the connection between romantic poetry and the Victorian novel. On a very obvious front, the Victorians novelists read the romantic poets. And so when you have someone like George Eliot, it's just so clear that she was influenced by Wordsworth. Um, but I'm especially interested in the kind of internalization of the principle of action that you get in a certain strand of the Victorian novel that is very interested in the development of character, in the portrayal of consciousness and free and direct style. These seem to me to emerge partly out of some of the thinking about selfhood that is at the very center of romantic poetry. I think it appears both in some formalistic devices like free and direct style, like George Eliot's use of epigraphs, um, but it appears also, I think, in valuation of failure, of the internal world that we see. One of my favorite sort of examples of the phenomenon that interests me is actually not something that appears in that book because I didn't know about it until later, but there's a graveyard close to where I live in New Haven, Connecticut, in a family graveyard plot for a prominent local family called the Foote family. And there are a pair of gravestones of a husband and wife there. And the wife's gravestone says, on no, the husband's, I'll start there. The husband's gravestone says on it, he achieved what he set out to do. And right next to it, you have the wife's gravestone, which says, she did what she could.
Wow.
Wow. So I guess I'm interested in the she did what she could.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I think there is a gendering there that's not random, but not exclusive either. Um, and I think of that she did what she could as having a generic element to it. And you see it, like I said, you see it in epigraphs, which are not that different from epitaphs, the form that I was just mentioning. But you also see it in moments, these little moments, these incursions of lyric into the world of the Victorian novel. And they can appear in just a sort of heightened sense uh, of of the sort of flow of the prose. So you can think of, Thomas Hardy, Tess in the Garden, when she's looking at all of the ephemeral insects around her. They can be more formal too, though. You can have a moment like I just wrote a chapter on George Eliot's poetry, which is coming out soon in a handbook of George Eliot's work, in which I focus in on a line from Middlemarch, spoken by the narrator about Casaubon. He knew no speck so troublesome as self. He knew no speck so troublesome as self. And I noticed this line for a variety of reasons because of the center of selfhood in it. But also, if you listen to it, he knew no speck so troublesome. Sorry, it's not he, it's actually I know no speck so troublesome as self. It's George Eliot's narrator speaking it, thinking about Casaubon. Um, it's iambic pentameter. So it's a verse form that enters into the prose at that moment. And I've always been interested in that kind of moment where suddenly the meter or of prose becomes regularized in a given way, or suddenly Jane Austen does that all the time, or suddenly you find a little rhyme. Is it intentional? Suddenly the prose starts to rhyme. Why does it do so? So those moments are really interesting to me.
Definitely, definitely. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate our conversation. I asked my last two questions, I just wanted to say that. So I think everyone has learned a lot. I've certainly learned a lot. So I want to say thank you. Um, I would just like to read a quote also from your book, A Crisis in Action. Um, Aristotelian models of development see character as the product of actions. Yet in the writings considered, perceptions of characters come not from what they do, but from what they cannot do. This shift has moral consequences. Must one do the right thing, or is it enough to will it? How does literary work relate to this question? So I think this definitely relates to what you were saying about she did what she could, right? And he achieved what he set out to do.
Yeah.
Is it enough to have good intentions and to
Yeah.
plan to do the right, unquote, the right thing, or plan to do something great, whatever that is? Or must you actually do it? Must you actually enact it? I'd love to hear a bit more about your thoughts on this, because I think it's a really interesting topic and one that's not thought about that much. But I think that distinction is very subtle, but also very powerful, very different. So I'd
Yeah, I
love
mean,
to
I
hear.
guess
Yeah.
I guess I mean, obviously in the world of novels, the distinction between what one set out to do and what one did do is different in the sense that sometimes by describing what can't be done, perhaps you're having an effect in the real world on what is done. So I don't want to completely get rid of the distinction. I think it's, I am in awe of people who achieve what they set out to do. But I also want to leave room to value she did what she could. Notice there, it's not quite internalized action, right? It is putting an extra emphasis on what is willed and seeing significance in what is willed. And it is, again, it's a significance that literature can explore just beautifully, right? Because literature has the affordances to tell us what someone wills as well as what someone does. And so I value that aspect of literature. But she did what she could also suggest that small scale deeds matter. And again, to turn to George Eliot, because I always find myself landing back with Middlemarch, these are unhistoric acts, right? To think of the language of the finale of Middlemarch that resonate potentially. And I do think I want to value that form of action, even as I value the form of literature that describes that form of action, which is the realist novel.
No, I think it's a very interesting distinction. And I think the idea of people grappling with that distinction during this period of change is also really interesting. The socio-political kind of situation of the long 19th century, I think, maybe put a kind of hyper emphasis on this distinction and people dealing with that. So I think it's really it's amazing, and it's an amazing book, and I tell everyone to go read it. My final question for you today is, do you have any advice for young scholars who are interested in the role of genre and form in literature, or literature of the long 19th century?
Yeah.
What can these people do if they're interested in it? What should they go study? What should they go pay attention to? Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's good to recognize your own strengths and your own interests and to work with them. But I would say, find the proper balance between reading widely and experimenting. But between reading deeply and experimenting. That is to say, if you have a true love of one particular genre, absolutely run with it. Read as much as you can within it, but force yourself outside of it a little too, and then look for the connections that might surprise you. And keep thinking about, I mean, I think it's useful always to keep thinking also about connections that aren't just across genres in a given period, but that go into the present and go all the way back to the past. So, I think when Caroline Levine thinks about The Wire in relation to Bleak House, for example, that's great. That'll keep things alive for us when we think about, modern problems of identity in relation to the problems of identity that you see in the 19th century novel. We want to keep things alive. So I do believe firmly in that. But I also like looking all the way back to the Odyssey and thinking about, how Odysseus struggles with identity in ways that are not unlike uh, Dorothea's struggles with identity in Middlemarch. So figure out the questions that interest you most and then ask them broadly. I think that's my advice.
I love that. Amazing. Thank you so much. I so appreciate talking to you today. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I believe that everyone listening to this will, take your advice and run with it. And I think these topics are fascinating. So thank you so much for talking to me about them today. I appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Daphne, and thanks for asking such great questions. And I wish you a good rest of your day and a safe train journey.
Thank you so much. Amazing. Thank you. Bye.